This is Kitty Wrigley, and I'm here interviewing my mother, Betty Ann Fuetsch Wrigley, on October 25th, 2018, in Springfield, Illinois. This interview is part of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Family Members Oral History Project. So, let's begin with your full name, date of birth, and place of birth.
My full name is Betty Ann Fuetsch Wrigley. I was born on June 29th, 1927. And I forgot what else you said.
Place of birth.
Oh, Collinsville, Illinois.
Thank you. Let's begin with where you were living when Pearl Harbor was bombed.
I was living in the Soulard section of South St. Louis.
Did you have a job at that time?
Yes, I did. I was probably working in an ice cream parlor at that time. That was in St. Louis, pretty close to downtown. Yeah, I remember being just a soda jerk or whatever they used to call them.
Were you living with your mother?
Yes. I was living with my mother and my older sister. And for some reason, I've totally blacked out my younger brother and sister. They were half sister and brother. I can't even remember them at that age. I don't know why that is. Infants, small toddlers, I remember. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, they're gone.
What is your recollection of the Pearl Harbor event?
Just that everyone was kind of agitated and unknown. They didn't understand what was going on. Where is Pearl Harbor? Mm-hmm. You know, that was one of the first things you heard everywhere. Where is Pearl Harbor? But it didn't take weeks, hardly, or days before I started seeing servicemen coming in the ice cream parlor.
Oh.
And it got quite busy. And I didn't work there very long because I got a little better job. After I left working in the ice cream parlor, I went to work at a cafeteria right downtown St. Louis, right across from the May Company. Famous bar is their street name, but they belonged to the May Company. And I worked 5:30 in the morning till 2:30 in the afternoon. And I was only like 15. I didn't like those hours very much, but I worked there for quite a while until I met some other family members, and my life direction sort of changed.
Tell me more about that.
Well, my mother was a single mother at that time, and my older sister had already, I think, gotten married and gone away. And I was introduced to a first cousin who had been lost to us. My mother has an older sister who had 4 boys, and somewhere along the line her husband was violently killed. I think it was, I don't know if it was an accident or if it was a crime, but anyway, he was gone. And here is my aunt with 3 boys. One is in her arms, one is a tiny toddler, and there were 2 that were like 6 and 8. She could not take care of them. There were no safety nets in those days. I mean, if a woman had babies or was left alone, her choices were find another man to help you take care of them. 4 children? Not likely. So she ended up putting her 2 older sons in the orphanage in Belleville, Illinois. And she kept the 2 babies, and I don't know how she managed. But somewhere along the line, those 2 boys got adopted out together. And they were, when she went back to the orphanage for the 3rd or 4th time, they were no longer there. She could not find them. And then comes World War II, the oldest one is looking for a birth certificate that says how old he really is, who he really is. And he couldn't find any information, so he went to the Belleville newspaper, the Belleville News-Democrat, and told this story. And one of my other aunts, my mother's youngest sister, she came from a big family, by the way, like 9 kids. And the younger sister was still in the general area, and she recognized his story because she knew her older sister had lost these 2 boys. So somehow or other they made a connection. The boys got to meet their real mother, and they got to meet us. They even got to meet their grandmother. My grandmother was still living at that time. And then he managed to get a birth certificate. They've decided he was too old for the draft, or he was 4F, which was not eligible, or whatever. And anyway, I got introduced to my cousin, the long-lost cousin, he and his brother, and we all had some family gatherings. And one day my new cousin said to my mother, "Could Betty come and go with us to Washington State? I'm going to go out to the shipyard and find work, because there's not work around here for me." And my mother said, "Sure." And of course, I'm a little taken aback by that. Sure. So anyway, we probably shortly thereafter left for Bremerton. And I stayed during the whole war with my cousin and his wife, and actually shared the same housing. The World War II workers' housing was specially built just for those of us coming to work in the shipyard. But while we were there, my newfound cousin's younger sister, who was not alive when he was a baby, she was the tail end, the youngest one. She came to live with us in the same World War II housing because her husband was a sailor and his shipping off spot was Bremerton. So she came to live with us in the same little place with her infant baby and a 5-year-old. So in a 2-bedroom, World War II government housing with a coal stove in the living room, and when we first got there was just dirt in the front yard, and it was sort of unfinished looking, but there were 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and we had a lot of people.
Let's go back briefly.
Okay.
And tell me your cousin's name and his wife's name, okay, and how you got to,
Okay. His real name was Harold Goebel, Goebel, and his brother was Carl. Their adopted name was something totally different, but they changed their names back to their real name when they were found. And his wife's name was Eleanor, and they were at least 10 years older than me because they were the older sister's children. And actually, Harold had a son, a young son, Delbert, who was living with his first wife somewhere. I don't know his whereabouts.
So some confusing
yes,
family history there.
Yes. We haven't even covered part of it, but it's, yes.
If I can go back a moment to Pearl Harbor, did you know anyone who was injured or was involved in Pearl Harbor?
Yes. I actually had another first cousin, the son of one of my mother's brothers, was on the Arizona when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and his body is still there. And that was Orville. He never went by that name, Orville John Langenwalter. But he's still entombed on the Arizona. other than that, I don't know of any other family members that are or were around or hurt on Pearl Harbor Day.
When you went to Bremerton, you mentioned the housing, but how did you get the job that enabled you to get government housing?
That was really strange because my cousin went to work right away. They hired him to be a welder, which he knew how to do. And of course, it was highly needed. His wife was not the kind of person that would go to work, like do that kind of work. But I applied right away, and I lied. I told him I was 17 and I was only 15. But they didn't ask me for a birth certificate. They just said, sure, you're hired. And I went to work right away. And my first part of my job, the first building I went into, was called the Shipfitters building. And I was called a shipfitter's helper. And I worked in there for probably 5 or 6 months. I'm just guessing at that. I don't remember exactly. But that's where I worked first. I went in there and I worked cutting rivets to size. But those were small aluminum rivets. I don't know where they used them. But thinking back on it, probably they were used on the new ships. They were actually building destroyer escorts. Those were the only new ships they were building at the shipyard. And that there wasn't much use for aluminum rivets in a battleship. They were big, heavy things. But I spent my day cutting rivets to length, proper lengths, with a big machine that, be careful of your fingers. Well, anyway, that's what I did for a while.
I have here your employee muster card.
Yeah.
Is there anything notable about that card?
My age. This was apparently renewed every year because this one says 1945 on it, and my age is 19. I was actually 17 when at this date, so I'm 2 years off. But it's the same card that I used for ID. I had to show this card when I went in the gate.
What about your name?
Oh, yeah, my last name's spelled wrong. And my last name has been spelled wrong most of my life. It's wrong on my birth certificate, my wedding license, my school records, everything. It's wrong because my mother and father separated when I was maybe 18 months old. And for some reason, my mother never corrected me on how to spell this name. It's wrong on everything. And I got kind of curious about my father, probably after you started family history work. And you handed me this box full of paper. So anyway, my husband and I went. Actually, the way I found this, I saw an obituary in the Collinsville paper that had a descendant, or what do you call it when someone dies? Someone's survivor in the family whose last name was spelled something like this. And I thought, whoa, I never saw this name before anywhere. And so I kept that clipping and made contact with those people and found out that my dad was buried in the Nashville cemetery, the National Cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee. So I went to visit him. And actually, I think that might be spelled wrong. The name might be spelled wrong on that stone, too. But anyway, somewhere along the line, I found out that it's not that way. It's spelled F-U-E, not F-E-U. And for all these years, I've been pronouncing it Fuetsch, like Deutsch. Not right. I actually talked with and emailed Fuetsch's in Austria and found out the Fuetsch family still lives there. This is how it's spelled. So anyway, that's how I found out.
A good story. Why do you suppose your cousin asked you along? And
I have no idea. Maybe he thought it'd be company for Eleanor because, you know, she wouldn't know anybody there and he'd be gone all the time. But anyway, I'm kind of glad he did ask me because it gave me a much broader look at life than I had in South St. Louis.
you mentioned already the house that you lived in as part of the government housing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe that for me? Walk me through the house.
It was actually lower in the front yard. You had one step up into the living room. There was a very tiny little efficiency kitchen and a fairly large, it went all the way from the back to the front of the building was the living room, which was helpful because we ended up having people sleeping on the sleep sofa. And I think we added a crib at one point. And upstairs, there were a half stairs because the back end of the building was up the hill. These buildings were on a hillside going like this, and they were fourplexes, but they went down like a couple of blocks, this row of fourplexes. And I had a room all of my own, and Harry and Eleanor had the other bedroom. And then when Harry's sister came to live with us with her baby and her little girl, they took the sleep sofa and the crib. The older girl slept on the sofa with her mother. And they stayed with us until the end of the war. But it turns out that was really good fortune for us because Harry's wife was a terrible cook. I mean, we could hardly eat her food. She made us a pumpkin pie one time that was so awful that we had to pretend we were eating it. But anyway, when Florence and the baby and the other little girl came, we had a good cook and someone who was interested in keeping the house and doing the laundry. And Eleanor went downtown and rented a building and opened a photo shop. One of those kind where, you know how, especially if you're a serviceman, you go in and you get a strip of little pictures on a strip and you can carry them right out with you. Well, that's the kind of shop she opened up. She knew how to do that because they had one in St. Louis before they moved. Anyway, the housing was, like I say, on bare ground. We had, some of us built fences around the little yard we had. Some of us had most of us had a coal bin by the back door because we heated the room with a heating stove in the living room. Of course, the winters are mild, kind of in the Northwest. They're not like they are here. I only saw snow a few times while I was there. But I do remember every time I walked out the front door, you always turned around and you looked at Mount Rainier. Always, every morning. That didn't mean you saw it every morning because it was cloudy or whatever, but we always did that. It was very nice.
Take me to work.
Oh boy.
How did you get into work?
We walked to the local bus stop and you took a bus. And I worked mostly swing shift. Go to work at 12 and get off at 8. And Harry, most of the time, he was moving around a lot. He sometimes had graveyard shifts or sometimes day. He changed a lot. I didn't. I was mostly on swing shift.
Okay.
But I always had to ride the bus because we didn't have much gasoline. We had ration tickets and stuff. And but anyway, I'd get on the bus. I'd be dressed already in my gear, I'd have coveralls, steel-toed boots, kerchief around my head. I didn't have a hard hat or gloves at home, but I put those on when I got to the yard. And when we go in the main gate, we always had to show the name tag. And I had quite a bit of a walk to the Shipfitters building when I first started. And then I'd sit there for, several hours and get a break, hopefully. But I always packed my lunch, too. I always took my lunch. I don't remember having anywhere on the base where I could go get food. I don't remember any vending machines. Maybe they didn't have them then. I don't remember. There were water fountains and restrooms and whatever on the various dry docks. And sometimes I'd work on a building on the dry docks, too, next to the ships. Mostly those would be when I was in the blueprint shop or
So you had more than one kind of work that you did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of those was catching hot rivets.
Yeah.
I don't really know what that is. Can you describe that for me?
Yeah, that's different. Especially if it's halfway dark, it's really different because I caught hot rivets. I didn't actually use a rivet gun ever, but I worked with a riveter. And number one, those rivet guns were this long. They were like a jackhammer. And I would have a funnel, maybe this big, around, and kind of a graduated tube. And I'd have long gloves up to here. And of course, I often wore goggles, too, at that point, because carbon would fly off of the big rivets. Anyway, somebody'd be down there about on the next deck, and they'd have this big machine that, it must have been electric, because they would heat these up until they were red hot, and the carbon would be flying off, and they'd take it and sling it up there, and I'd have to catch it. And I never missed one. But anyway, I would take a tongs then and put it in the bulkhead, in the hole. And my rivet guy that I was working with would rivet the rivet into the hole, but there'd be somebody on the back side that I wouldn't see. That was the bucker. He would hold against it to flatten it out on the back side. You know what they were doing at that time was reinforcing the deck steel, putting another layer of steel. That's why the California was in dry dock for so long. They were putting more steel layers on the deck and more steel layers on the bulkheads. And that's why I can't hear. So anyway. And
no air protection?
No, nobody thought about that. Mm-mm. But anyway, I did that quite a lot of times. That's one of my bigger jobs that I did more often.
Let's clarify at this point the year that you went to Bremerton, that you started there.
Okay, April of 1943. Okay. I would actually turn 16 in 2 months. So I was 15 when I first started.
And you mentioned the California. Tell me about working on the California.
That was the BB-44. And it was sunk at Pearl Harbor. It was not blown over on its side like the Arizona, but it did take a bomb right down in the magazine. So it blew up, pretty much damage inside. But it scuttled. It went flat, sat down flat. And they were able to raise it up. They did several of the battleships that way. And they raised the California up and did temporary repairs in Pearl Harbor. And then they brought it to Bremerton. Bremerton was there were only 2 Navy yards on the West Coast that were big enough to handle the big ships like the battleships and the aircraft carriers. I think the other was in San Diego. We had, I don't remember if I even told you this, but we had, what do they call them, barrage balloons all around the shipyard when I first got there. They didn't keep them there for the whole time during the war. I think once they figured the danger was over and they didn't need them anymore, the barrage balloons came down. But they were all up there when I first got there.
How did you feel, 15 years old, and arriving to work for the first time?
I wish I had paid more attention. I really am not, I was just a teenager, and so I think I wasn't paying mind to how important things were. But I did, shortly thereafter, I started thinking, boy, that was something. Because I had never met anybody else that had done that. Not once I got away from Bremerton, they all looked at me like I had 3 heads or something. They, you did that? Yeah, I did.
So when you caught rivets, you did that your entire shift?
No, I wouldn't say I did that, because they would finish a job and they would maybe have to go to another location, and then it'd take time to do that, so they'd give me little jobs to do in between. Or I did spend a lot of my off time in the blueprint shops on the dry dock.
What happened in blueprint shops?
Well, number one, they have gangplanks with Marines stationed on the entry points. And I was going off the gangplank one day, and there's a young man that I know from St. Louis. It turns out he was my best girlfriend's brother, Herbert Gruber. But anyway, he was a Marine, and the sailors used to make fun of him. He said, "Oh, they're just sea-going bellhops," is what they called him, because they were just standing guard. They weren't out there being a Marine, you know. But anyway, I met Herb while I was coming off. Then I'd go to the deck. They'd be like little shack-type buildings on the dry dock, where the work days would be scheduled, and they'd have each of the leaders, or they called them leadermen and quartermen. They would be given their work schedules for that day, and I would just hand them out as they were needed. And there'd be quite a lot of them for a battleship, you know. So that was pretty easy. It was basically just filing. So, but I did that part of the time too. If I knew ahead of time I was going to do that and nothing else, I could even wear a dress to work. That was kind of a nice feeling for a change.
Tell me about working on the Bunker Hill.
Well, I don't really remember a whole lot about the work I did. A lot of once we got done with the California, which, see, I spent 11 months on that one ship. I went just from here to there for day jobs. Some of them would be rivet catching, but not a whole lot, because they didn't have that kind of damage that was long-term stuff, like replacing bulkheads and strengthening bulkheads. They would be for smaller jobs. Of course, the Bunker Hill was, I don't remember working on that when it was so badly damaged. I think I was I went on to see that one because they let everybody see. It was such a horrific damage to that ship, and so many men lost their lives on that one. But I remember going on that one earlier. I think it must have been on an earlier visit to the yard, because more than once they would come in. They'd be in once and go out and come back. And that happened a few times with especially the aircraft carriers. The battleships, once they left, I don't remember them coming back. So there was a submarine in there one year, and I never did get to see it. I walked by it, was in dry dock, but I never did get to go on that one.
So was it a tour of
The Bunker Hill?
damage?
Yeah, they actually, the damage was so bad, and they wanted the workers to see what they survived, and it was pretty, well, they had to stay in specific places because of the damage, so we didn't get to walk all over it like you can a ship that's not damaged like that. But we did get to go up and see close up. You could see all the way down to the flight deck, not the flight deck, the hangar deck. And even that looked damaged below that too. So it was pretty scary. And they lost a lot of airplanes too. A lot of them didn't get off the ship when they got hit.
So what did you do at the Bunker Hill? Do you remember that?
No, I think mainly I just worked. I do remember going below decks, and that might have been on the Bunker Hill. I can't remember exactly. But I went below decks, and if there were no riveting to do, I also worked with welders and chippers and grinders. Welders would make a long seam, and the grinders would come along and smooth it out. But then I would go down below deck when they were finished, and I ran a machine, an air pressure machine. I would pump air into a compartment, and I could tell from the instruments that I had that when it was built up enough, and they would go around and inspect all of the welds and the rivets to see if they were airtight. And of course, if it was airtight, it was watertight. And these were way down below decks in little compartments. That was kind of fun because I'd have to climb up and down these ladders that have a rung welded right to the bulkhead, so they were straight up and straight down. But it was kind of fun. I was young and I could do that. They had some around the turrets in the battleships, around those great big gun turrets. I was working on stuff like that too, and climbing up those ladders. And yeah, I forgot the size of those guns. Number 5? That doesn't sound right. But anyway, the big ones. That was interesting.
Did you ever have an unusual or memorable experience while you were working in below decks?
Well, I did have one young sailor that got kind of embarrassed. I probably was working on that air pressure machine, and I heard somebody just swearing up a blue streak. I mean, every swear word I ever heard in my life. And there's a bulk, or whatever you call him. I can't remember. The little hole in the deck. And pretty soon here, this young fellow his back is to me. He sticks his head up, and he's just swearing like crazy. And I'm sitting there, and pretty soon he turns around. Oh, man, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But he was really nice. He apologized, and off he went. I forgot what you call those. Hatch, I think. Okay. Anyway, that was...
So
Other than that, no.
What was it like below decks?
Dark. And it was like a hive. It was so many compartments, so many stairways, so many ladders. You could get lost very easily. I never was around where the engines were. Thank goodness. I really would have gotten lost because I don't know. I found out later that they had hired a crew of black ladies, and I didn't even know they were around, but they cleaned the bilges. They gave them the dirtiest job that there was in the shipyard.
What do you mean by cleaning the bilges?
Well, it's the very bottom of the ship, and it's where the oily residue collects and stuff. And those ladies were given the job to clean those bilges. And it's funny because I never saw any black people while I was there. I never met one of those ladies on the job, but I saw a picture in one of my magazines that I brought home, and there's a big picture of them. And I think, where were they when I was there? Because I didn't see them. I bet they made them work the graveyard shift, 12 at night to 8 in the morning. That's my assumption. So,
what are some other memorable vessels that you worked on?
well, I worked on battleships a lot, on the Maryland, the Tennessee, the West Virginia. None of them for as long as the California, but for several months, maybe at a time. And that's where I spent most of my time at the yard, was on those battleships. The others were just short visits.
How long did you work on the West Virginia?
Oh, maybe 3 months.
Do you remember what you did there?
Same thing. I didn't really do anything else. I caught rivets. I ran the air machine. If I ran out of work, they'd send me back to the Shipfitters building so I could work on something else. And but that was basically all I did. I did, when I was working in the blueprint shops, I also had this extra job of passing out cigarettes. Cigarettes were hard to find back then, and of course everybody smoked, including me, for a while. I think I smoked 6 or 7 months. But anyway, cigarettes were rationed, and I had a whole list of names somewhere in this little book. There's a list of names of people who would be on the list, and I would get cigarettes every couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. Maybe 1 or 2 cartons of Lucky Strikes, Camels, whatever the name brands were. But most of them were no-name brands, and everybody, yeah, that's it. Everybody wanted the Lucky Strikes and the Camels. So I ended up having to give them 1 or 2 packs and then filling in the rest of whatever they got with the no-name brands. And I don't remember what the money was, but apparently I collected money for them too. They paid for them, and all of these people were smokers.
You're holding a book that you used while you worked out in Bremerton, mm-hmm. and you have lots of different things in it. But right now, you're looking at the cigarette rationing page.
Yeah. And some of those men, and they were all men, I think. Some of these men had numbers, badge numbers, that were a lot lower than mine.
What was yours?
My number's 52034, but some of these are 22, 540, 26, 32, 34. There's only about 8 that were lower than mine, so I got started before a lot of these folks. By the time I left the shipyard, that number, mine is 52,034. Before I left to go back home, that number was 200,000 something. That's how many people have gone in and out of that shipyard while I was there. Yeah.
Did you do the cigarette rationing your entire time there?
Pretty much, yeah.
Was it just for a limited number of people?
Yes, probably a dozen or 2 at the most.
Okay. Did you ever have or see an accident?
I can't remember. I don't remember seeing an accident.
Did anything ever happen to you?
Mm-mm. Oh, something funny happened to me once. Do you know what a caisson is? At the end of a dry dock, the ship is in the dry dock, and there's strips in between each dry dock. But then at the very end, by the water, there's a caisson. That's what opens and closes so they'll let the water in and out. I was walking across the caisson one day, and I got bombed by a seagull. I know, it's dumb. But I did. Luckily, I had my little scarf on my head.
Why did you wear a scarf?
Well, you were around dangerous equipment, and it was better to have it covered. And especially, I guess, when I was around the people that are close to equipment, moving equipment, probably needed it worse than I did, although I can imagine that carbon was hot. It could have gotten in your hair. That wouldn't be fine. But anyway.
What about asbestos? Were you exposed to asbestos?
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things I found out in my adult life. Probably around 1980 or so, I discovered that I had asbestosis, and I had to have my lungs x-rayed once a year or something like that. I've been fortunate. It never progressed. It's very visible. When I had later surgery, it was the people at the technicians always mentioned, you know, you have plaque on your lungs. And of course, the first thing they asked me was, did you ever work in a shipyard? So a lot of us came home with asbestosis. And my other defect now is, of course, hearing. So both of those occurred from working in the shipyard.
Were the riveters men or women?
Oh, they were men. You couldn't lift one of those kind of guns. They were big, heavy rivet guns. And I suspect that they probably had a limit to how many they could do in a day or without having a break, because they were heavy. They were, like I say, they were like the size of a jackhammer. They were very big. But the rivets were, you know, an inch in diameter at least. So, I forgot where I was going with that.
Well, that's okay. How about your colleagues at work and friends?
I had one good girlfriend while I was there, but she did not work in the shipyard. But anyway, I did have a good girlfriend that we would go out and socialize with, and actually I dated her brother for a while, who was in the Navy. And later in the time I was there, I met her mother and father as well. So actually I met one of my riveter persons. I think his name was Posey. And I think that was his last name, and nobody called him anything else, Posey. But he used to invite me to dinner on Sunday, and he would invite a sailor. He was trying to do some matchmaking. It didn't take, though.
That brings me to another thing that I would like to call your attention to. I think you dated at least once, maybe more, and corresponded a little with a sailor, Bruce S. Campbell, from Texas. And you saved half a dozen letters that he sent to you during that time. This last letter that you've saved is, the postmark is November 21st, 1944. There's no date on the letter. And I would like to just read a tiny portion of that. Quite a lot of water has gone under the bridge since I was there with you. It seems more like a dream than reality. I certainly wish we had met sooner. There wasn't much time to get to know each other well. Perhaps someday we will meet again when this war is over. And the P.S. at the end is, pardon the writing, the ship is rocking. And the next month, something happened to his ship.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to talk about that?
He was on the destroyer, the USS Bunker Hill, and that was a World War I destroyer. And there were actually 3 of those destroyers, the same vintage. And they got caught in this typhoon off of the Philippines. And Bruce's ship was sunk, and one of the other destroyers was sunk. And on Bruce's ship, there were 5 survivors out of the whole crew.
That's okay.
And anyway, we were not that close, but he was a really nice-looking young man, and he was such a sweet person. And he was only like 21 years old or so. And I struggled with trying to figure out, he must be lost. There's only 5 survivors. So I made some kind of an effort to locate his parents, so I could write and find out if he actually died. I was certain his chances would not have been good. So anyway, I don't even know how I found out his address, because Texas is a big place, and I don't remember having a reason to know his home address. But anyway, I wrote to his parents, and I got a letter back, and they told me, yes, he had been lost. And so anyway, that was one of my saddest experiences. I was very fortunate in that later in my time in Bremerton, when the other half of the family came, and Florence's husband was also in the Pacific on a destroyer, but he was on a newer one, and I don't really know what battles he was in, or if any. But he ended up with asbestosis, by the way, too. But they lived with us until he got released from the Navy after the war was over. So the 2 families were living in this housing until pretty close to the end of the war.
How did you meet Bruce Campbell?
You met sailors everywhere. There were thousands of sailors. You'd go into a business, and I went to the USO, and I went to ship's dances. Whenever a ship was completed and ready to go back to sea, we would get a thank you note from the admirals or the captains. And sometimes they would also issue invitations to the young single ladies to come to a ship's dance that would be held prior to them leaving. And I always went to those whenever I got an invitation. And you'd meet a whole lot of sailors when you were there, because you seldom went with a date. Because if you dated a sailor, half the time they weren't there. So anyway, I'm sure I met Bruce at one of those dances. And I actually went with one sailor that I got pretty close to for a while. And but the ladies would wear formals. Nobody had cars. The sailors certainly didn't have cars. And so I, on a couple of occasions, wore a formal. I'd get on the bus in the formal and go to the dance and make my way home the same way. And they they were held at like a service center. I don't know what they call them, but almost all bases have a recreation center. And the one in Bremerton was called Craven Center. And that's where most of the dances would be held. I went to the YMCA also for dances occasionally, but those were funny. They had dances where you learned how to do square dance stuff and schottisches and polkas, and once in a while I'd dance with little old men. I mean, really old, because they were too old to work and too old to go to war. But they knew those kinds of dances. But anyway, you found your entertainment where you could.
So these invitations to dances, were those just to crew that had worked on their ship?
Mm-hmm. Those invitations were,
so
yeah.
One of them says the Flying Lady.
Mm-hmm.
And they have, well, there are a variety of different ships that you saved the dance invitations to.
Mm-hmm.
And you also sent, they also sent you thank you notes. Tell me what that was about.
Well, you know, especially ships that were in there quite a while, they always wanted to, if the work was very extensive, they'd make up these thank you notes because they had a pretty big crew working on them. And but they also would put on these thank you notes their records at sea. It would show on there how many ships they had sunk, how many aircraft they had shot down. It would show submarine things on there, but then there'd be just a little note from the captain saying, thank you for the good work that you folks have done getting us back to sea. And most of the time they'd have a picture of the ship on the front. One just had a drawing, but most of the time it was a picture, and that was kind of nice to have a memento from that kind of a workplace.
I recall seeing one from the California.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do anything else with the seams below decks? I remember you talking to me about soap.
Yeah, well, first they would also grind them off. The grinder would, most welds would be raised, you know, when you first do it. They'd grind them smooth, and then you'd have to check them to be waterproof or airproof or whatever.
So did you do that in addition to running this pressure machine?
No, I didn't do any of that. I just watched them do it.
Watched them do it.
Yeah.
Okay. What other notable jobs on notable ships or things like that that really stand out?
Mm. Huh. Interesting. It's kind of hard to pinpoint one.
Mm.
I think just going on those big ships, the job itself seemed so small. But you felt like you were doing your share, of course. But I don't recall if the job was any different. I was doing the same job in each place. But I did like the idea of when you get on that aircraft carrier, for instance, it's like walking a couple of city blocks. You're just walking forever if you're on the hangar deck or up above on the flight deck. It was a long walk.
Did you get lost?
Oh, you could. You could.
But you didn't.
No, I probably figured out my way.
I noticed that something interesting about your paper that you got at the end of the war when they laid you off.
Mm-hmm.
So let's take a look at that. Tell me how much you earned.
$7.60 per diem. Per diem. Must have been a week. Can't be right, a day? Can't remember. It wasn't very much, was it?
It was probably per day.
Yeah, probably. production. My name is wrong on here too. It's wrong on everything. Resignation, involuntary, confirmatory. Did you notice the date? October 1945. So I was laid off just a couple of months after VJ Day, October 1945.
What about your birth date?
Well, my birth date's wrong too. I would have been, instead of 19, like it says there, I was only 17. But my annual leave to be paid, that was $299.25. That's how much I had left. Yeah. Resignation involuntary. Available for other government employment. I don't know why I kept that. I didn't keep any other papers that I recall.
Well, there are a few that I want to get to. But before I do that, I'm thinking that when you went to work, you had to report to someone to get your work for the day.
Mm-hmm.
Who did you work for? Who was your supervisor?
Well, my top boss was a man by the name of McDougall, and he was called a quarterman. And then the next layer below him would be a lead man. And I can't remember his name, actually, but the riveter that I worked for was Posey, that I worked with. And
did you work with him from one ship to the next?
oh yeah, pretty much. Yeah, we were pretty much the crew, and we would stay with the same crew most of the time. If one was gone or on sick or whatever, then you'd get assigned to somebody else. But mostly we worked with the same crew, which was kind of nice because you got to know these people pretty well. Like I say, Posey asked me to dinner. I've got to meet his wife. I think his family he had boys in the service. I got to know quite a few people that actually lived in the area, but most of them that I did meet were resettled for the war. They came from other places, like my girlfriend Bonnie that I had there. She was from Minnesota, and her older brother, the one in the Navy, he was in the Navy before the war, but her mom and dad had actually just moved from Minnesota to the Bremerton area. And a lot of people there did that. They made that move once the war started. And most of them stayed there. They didn't have a temporary place. They bought their own home.
Well, I see that you have kept your 1945 W-2 withholding receipt. First, I noticed your total wages for the year were $2,587.03. And I know that you left the Navy Yard on October the 3rd of 1945, but on October the 15th, you already have a pay stub from Pacific Telephone and Telegraph. So how did that transition happen so quickly?
Bonnie's mother worked at the telephone company. So she said, when I knew I was going to get laid off right away because the women were the first to go after the war was over. And so my cousin was still working. He was still a welder, and he didn't get laid off. So I applied at the telephone company, got hired right away. 2 weeks later, I had another paycheck from the telephone company.
What did you do at the phone company?
I was an operator. I worked at the old switchboard with the horn here and the big ear things here. and you had to stand up on your high stool and reach way up there to put your number please thing in. It was fun too. Oops.
How long did you work at the phone company?
Until we came back home, I guess about 11 months, something like that.
11 months.
I think, I'm guessing. It's we came back to St. Louis in October of 46. So yeah, it would be close to 11 months. Mm-hmm. And then when I came back home, I thought, well, I'll try to get on at the telephone company, but I don't know why I didn't do that right away. I went to work for Singer Sewing Machine Company. And of course, there was no problem finding a job then. You could get a job anywhere. But after working at the sewing machine company, I thought, you know what, I'm going back to the phone company. So it's just a couple blocks down the street, so I applied and I started working at the phone company in St. Louis.
What was bad about working for the Singer company?
Well, it was just a small office, and I was just a file clerk there, and I thought I wanted to do something else. So, and I think it was a little bit more safe employment as far as stability. So and it was just a couple blocks away from where I was working. So I got on there right away because I had previous experience. And I stayed with them for about 3 years, maybe more. Then I took a temporary retirement.
How did the whole experience of working in the shipyard, going out there away from your family at such a young age, how did that affect you? How did that change you?
Well, actually, I think it helped me a lot. It broadened my worldview, or whatever you want to call it. But I didn't get to finish my education. For that, I was sorry. But I did seem to have a broader view of life. And I was happy with that. I liked the idea that I had done something that seemed, at least a little important. And I've always been a voracious reader, and I did so while I was there, as well as after I got home. And it broadened my outlook. I met so many people from so many places, and that was good for me. It broadened my life. It really did.
Thank you.
Oh my.